Hello, we are from Syntero. We are a nonprofit counseling agency that provides mental health services to youth, adults, people of all ages. But I am Shantel Jordan. I am the school-based coordinator for Hilliard City Schools.
And my name is Kelly Dainton, and I am a school-based clinician that works for Hilliard City Schools. And today we are going to discuss talking about youth or talking with youth and how to talk to them about race. So our goal today is really for caregivers and parents is to help you understand that we have the ability to speak to our youth about race and race-related issues, and that doing so will positively impact our youth and community. So there are a lot of things going on currently in our society that your youth may be seeing, that we are all seeing together. So it's really important to have these conversations to help create a more understanding and empathetic community.
And some of our objectives for today, we are going to be talking to you in hopes that you understand how science reinforces racism. We're going to be teaching you some helpful language that you can have when you're having these conversations with your youth, with a focus on a shared vocabulary. And then as far as skills go, we really want to make sure that caregivers and parents are able to start developing an action plan for how you're going to start or continue, if you've already been doing that, continue conversations about race with your child.
So first things first, just to kind of learn a little bit more about us and our background. My background is I do identify as a Caucasian white woman. Half of my biological family is we all identify as Caucasian white people. I grew up in a rural Ohio community, and 97% of the population there also identified as white. And then my husband's family is Hispanic. They're from Colombia. And even saying that, I'm still not an expert on Hispanic culture. So I'm still learning to understand minorities in different cultures. So it's really important to me to kind of do this work and understand these things, but I'm not the expert on them, and I'm still learning and growing. I do understand my privilege and what that means in this society. And it took a lot of vulnerability and uncomfortable conversations to kind of identify this and recognize it. And I'm definitely not a voice for minorities at all. I'm just really an ally trying to do the work. And I'm working really hard to become anti-racist and build a more equitable community.
And like Kelly, I also come from a diverse family. The majority of my biological family identifies as Black, and then a good portion of my family identifies as white. My dad remarried, and my stepmother is a white woman, and my extended family, whom we're very close with, all identify as white. And we all have differing opinions about race and equity, and often having conversations about that. I specifically identify as a Black woman. However, I can only speak to my personal experiences. I am not the voice for all BIPOC folks or minority. That acronym BIPOC just stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. You might see that throughout the presentation or in other presentations, but I'm not the voice for all minorities. I, like Kelly, am also still learning and working towards being anti-racist, and really just wanting to be an advocate for minority populations or just other more marginalized populations that don't have as much of a voice.
Okay, so I really, really like this quote from Teaching Tolerance. And it discusses that it is uncomfortable talking about race, and specifically white identifying people do have a hard time talking and having these conversations. So we may be uncomfortable talking about race, but we can no longer afford to be silent. Parenting requires us to put our efforts second to those of children. So it's really important to have these conversations with our children and our youth because they are seeing these things, they're experiencing them, and it will build a more equitable and empathetic community. So one of the first things I want to discuss is the myth of colorblindness. When you hear them say, oh, I'm colorblind, why do we see color? And that's something that I was guilty of for many, many years until I was engaging in more uncomfortable conversations and becoming more vulnerable about what it meant and who it was for me. So while it has really good intentions when you say you're colorblind, it can also have kind of negative implications there as well. So when you say things like, I don't see color, like I said, you do often mean well by that statement, and it can seem like a positive thing on the surface, but it's also something that can be used to kind of deflect the conversation on race and the uncomfortable feelings that can come up when talking about it. But saying you are colorblind kind of implies that you might not care about another person's race or their experiences with their race in this society. And it can imply that their reality is not real and it doesn't matter. So the concept of colorblindness, it erases an individual's identity and culture and can make them feel invisible and not heard or validated. So by acknowledging race, you actually are acknowledging all of our inherent differences and appreciating them for what they are. So you're acknowledging other experiences as different from your own and that they are just as valid. So we're going to listen to this or watch this short video that I think goes also more in depth to explain colorblindness. I think it's really great to kind of understand what it really means and what are some more implications behind using this term.
Hear politicians as well as teachers, ordinary folks say we ought to be colorblind. We ought not to see or care about race anymore. But for me, rather than being a virtue, I see colorblindness as often a form of cruelty. To say that you don't care about another person's race is often to say you don't care about their racialized experience.
Well, I think color blindness is a concept or a word that we use more as a deflection mechanism to avoid dealing with the problem.
But the idea that this is a colorblind society is not exactly well accepted in communities of color. And when people insist that we are colorblind, and what you're saying is that their reality is not real.
When it comes to race, what we seem to have decided, it is better if we don't notice when they are people of color, right? Or if we notice that we don't talk about it. So even more than color blindness, it's color muteness. Something Julian Bonds told us for years, that to be blind to color is to be blind to the consequences of color. And as he puts it, especially the consequences of being the wrong color in the United States.
Hear politicians as well as teachers.
Okay, so why is it important to talk about race with our youth? Well, first, it builds the capacity to engage in conversations about race and respond to racism when it's happening. If these conversations start now, our students might feel more prepared to speak out rather than stay in that bystander role. And that could be for a friend, or it even could be for themselves, standing up for themselves in certain situations. It's also important because it can develop resilience and it promotes safety for Black children and adolescents and other youth of color. So it begins to open that door of communication. If they can feel safe, if they know that you're open to having these conversations, they will start to come to you about their experiences, whether it's their own personal experiences or even if it's concerns about friends' experiences. It also fosters empathy in white children and adolescents, teaching them how to empathize with experiences of racism and how to be good friends to Black and brown youth. So it's easy to not really notice a problem when you're not directly affected by it. So when we talk to our white children about racism, it's a lot easier for them to then empathize with their friends who might be experiencing something different. It also allows you to acknowledge the realities that are present in the news and media. There are a lot of things in the news and on social media. And so when we have these conversations, we can make sure that our students are getting accurate information. If the only news that they're getting is from social media, it's highly likely that a lot of that is inaccurate or not true. So we're opening the door to make sure that they are getting factual information. And it's also an opportunity to teach values, both explicitly talking about those values, but also by modeling and leading by example, having those conversations about how you might handle a situation regarding racism, whether that's in a bystander or hopefully, whether that's in an active role of standing up for someone or even having to advocate for yourself in certain situations. And then finally, it deepens those relationships by talking about their viewpoints and demonstrating that you trust them with difficult conversations. It's going to open that door for communication, and they're going to come to you with other situations that might be more difficult. So by opening that door now, it really just opens that communication for other conversations.
So what does it mean to talk about race and diversity? We're going to go over some helpful language now. And the first thing we are going to discuss is race and kind of where it comes from and what it means. So race as we know it has no deterministic biological basis. All the same, race is so powerful that it can have life or death consequences. So what this means is biologically, race doesn't really have any differences in that regard, but it's more of a social construct that we have created to categorize people. And it's very real and it can be very dangerous for certain minority groups. So socially defined race, which is an arbitrarily organized combination of physical traits, geographic ancestry, language, religion, and a variety of other cultural features. Social definitions of race differ depending on context, but they always operate in the service of social dominance hierarchies. So what that means is essentially it's a ranking system or a class system. They're created to kind of rank and put people in classes in different systems. And recently we are learning more, like we used to think that race was more biological and you could tell and kind of understand in that regard, looking at like bone structure, but we've actually found out that really the only biological quality that's starting to show up is that kind of different races may have different genetic factors or different diseases that they're susceptible to. So it can help us in the medical sense, but even basing off of like ancestry, that still is a social contract, like of where they lived in the world or geographically or where they work. So we really created race to categorize people.
Some other helpful terms to know, just the word diversity, we hear that a lot, but it basically just means a group of people that we're usually talking about folks from different ethnicities or different races. So just a group being composed of a variety of people. And then identity. So this is a set of characteristics that are both visible and invisible. And we use that to categorize and define ourselves. So that could be, race could be part of that identity. We often use sex, female or male, or other terms to identify ourselves. And then intersectionality, this was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it just describes how each person belongs to multiple overlapping identity groups. And the ways that our identities overlap can result in either multiple oppressions or even privileges. So as a Black woman being in two different, identifying myself in kind of two different categories, I have potential oppression or discrimination based on being Black, but then also as being a woman. So those two kind of overlap. A Black man might have some privileges based on being male, but then those oppressions related to being Black or other ways. So that's just kind of some examples of intersectionality and how they overlap.
Some other helpful language that can be categorized among the injustice category. Bias. So these can be conscious or unconscious prejudice against an individual or a group based on their identity. And as I said, like a lot of our biases are either conscious. So we're aware that we have certain discriminations or ideas about certain groups, whereas they could also be unconscious or implicit where they exist within us, but we aren't too aware of them, or we're not too sure like where they came from or how they've just been ingrained into us over our lifetime. And we all have these biases. So it's not like one person is bias free. Everybody has biases because we've all been exposed to so many different things and grown up in so many different ways. Discrimination is another thing or language that is helpful to know. So discrimination is a prejudice in action. It's an unfair treatment of a person or group based on their identity. It can be interpersonal, so from person to person. You can discriminate someone based on their identity individually, and also systemic. So our society has constructs set up that are meant and put there to discriminate against certain minority groups. And they are very real and they happen. So it's important to understand not only on a personal level that discrimination happens, but on a societal level, and a systemic level that it happens as well. And then privilege, this is another word that is, we're hearing a lot more about it, or it's more of a popular word now for us to understand, because privilege is very real. And like Shantel talked about at the last slide, we all do have certain privileges or oppressions based on which group we identify with. So privilege is an unearned access to resources that are only readily available to some people because of their identity group membership. So it's an advantage or immunity granted or enjoyed by one identity group above and beyond the common advantage of all other groups. And sometimes it's invisible to those who have it. So I'm going to talk about white privilege a little bit, because like I said, it took me a while to kind of understand what my privilege is and what white privilege is, and that is very real, and I have it. So there's a cool study I just read. It came out in 2016 by Sonia Peng et al. And her colleagues, in which they created resumes for Asian and Black candidates. And they included the same content, experiences, qualifications, and they sent them out to 1,600 different job listings. But they had two different groups of resumes. So some of the resumes included racial cues and identities of these candidates, whether that be usage of their names, their languages, things that would identify their racial cues. And then they had another group where they kind of whitewashed these resumes, where they would change names, or they kind of eliminated all racial cues. And they found that the whitened or whitewashed resumes for Black candidates garnished 25% more callbacks than the non-whitened resumes, where only 11% got callbacks. And then for the Asian candidates, 21% of the whitewashed resumes got callbacks versus only 11.5 of the racial cued resumes. So this shows that white privilege does exist, and white people, we do have an advantage. Like, we do not have to worry about sending in our resume and, hey, what will they think of my name? Or will they question why I speak these languages? So that's something that kind of shows the very realness of white privilege. And I'm also saying, like, white people, we also do experience hardships and maybe even prejudices based on what groups we identify with, but it will not be due to race. So we do, as a race, have an immunity against race-based discrimination or race-based violence.
So now that we've talked about some helpful terms to start having these conversations, how do we start action planning? What do you need to do to prepare to have these conversations with our children? So the first thing is determining, why do you need to talk to your youth about race? And that's going to be different for every family. If you identify as a minority, you are often having these conversations earlier in life because of the way that minorities are potentially treated different in society. So these conversations might be happening sooner. If you do not identify as a minority, for your family, why would that be helpful to talk to your kids about race? Is it to be able to talk about what's going on in the news when they have questions? Is it to be able to support friends that they might be concerned about? Figuring out what's the why for you is step one. Step two, what else do I need to know about race before engaging in these conversations? If you have little ones, why? why? They have all the questions. Even older kids still have questions. And so it's really helpful to make sure that there aren't any gaps in your learning. That's not to say that you're going to have all the answers, because you won't. Kelly and I don't have all the answers on talking about race. But by starting with where are those gaps that you need to learn more about, that's going to be helpful. Identifying any biases that you might have. Kelly talked about that earlier. We all have biases that are often unintentionally, unknowingly downloaded into us because of the media, because of certain values that we grew up around. Whether we agree with those values or not, they're ingrained and we kind of have an automatic response to certain situations. But having a bias is a negative thing per se, but it's when we start to act on those biases and it turns into discrimination. So if you can have more accurate knowledge of what biases you already have, that's going to be helpful to start those conversations. Also thinking about, what could my youth and I learn together about race? Like I said before, we're not going to have all of the questions. And so I love when parents are able to come to their children and say, you know what, I don't know that answer. Let's look it up together. It really models for your kids the ability to question different things and start to educate themselves and find ways to make sure that they're getting accurate information. And then finally, what can my youth teach me about race and diversity? We don't often give our kids enough credit. They are often ahead of the game of where we are. So what could they teach us to kind of start those conversations? And being open to hearing what they have to say can be really helpful. So these are just the first steps in getting an action plan to talk to your children about race. We have some resources that we can share with different books, videos, and it's broken down by age group from preschool all the way up to high school. And really some great resources to help you with those conversations. So we'll share those out with you, and then be looking for our part 2, which goes into a little bit more in depth on action planning on how to talk to your child about race. So thank you for joining us, and we hope that you were able to learn and at least start thinking about how you're going to talk to your kids about race.